Afternoon all, let's continue our look at the evolution of style and take the next interesting decisive game from the World Championship match of 1934. I know we're trawling along this rematch, and there were many other players at the time. For example, Karez, Rozewski, Vidmar, and others. Of course, Juve was in the match after, Max Erver. If you know any other strong players around this time, 1934, please let me know in the comments of the video. And what we'll try and do, after covering the important decisive games of this match, maybe we should take each of those players at around this time and give them credit with one or two games and their potential impact on chess style. The World Championship matches, though, were given huge attention by the media. There was also, by the way, the Olympiads to consider. They had been running a few years till 1934 already, and Kaz had been doing well in the Olympiads around this time. So I think that is one player definitely. Before going on to the Juve match, to look at a few games of Kaz, which there is already a video on the channel about how he's beaten like about 9 of the world champions. It was called the Crown Prince of chess, and he was already a strong candidate really. If he got to play Alekhine, it might have been a different story in a match, even around this time. Okay, so in this game anyway, Alekhine was playing white. He played e4. After e5, we get the Ruy Lopez, which is a favourite of many World Championship matches. After a6, bishop a4, and now knight f6, and now a slightly unusual move, perhaps not overly critical, is played here. Bishop takes c6, and there is some explanation given by Alexander in his best games of chess. He said apparently he chose in this game the exchange variation because although playing with the white pieces, he did not cherish any particular ambitions. As a consequence of the match arrangements, he had to spend the whole of the previous night travelling by car from Munich to Beirut, and he hardly felt fit for intensive mental work. Now that's actually, to me, this is quite an interesting thing to associate opening choices with how you feel, how much energy you've got. And to be honest, I don't automatically link the exchange variation of the Ruy Lopez with not having to do that much work. This manoeuvre, of course, we've seen in the recent World Championship match against the Sicilian. Bishop b5 taking c6 and a slightly different opening completely. But the idea of taking on c6, it does often lead to less tactically complex games and more about the double pawns and how they're going to sort of liberate or not. So what happens here with the double pawns? Okay, and the bishop pair of black, of course, that black gets. So knight c3 is now protecting e4, so e5 is also under fire now. It's protected rather awkwardly. Now d3 and now c5. Okay. Now h3 prevents the bishop g4 pin. And okay, you might think, well, couldn't it have been played here? Bishop g4. Possibly. There might be some other ideas behind it as well. Let's not dwell on that too much. Bishop e6 was played, and white's not bothered about black dissolving the pawns here. He just plays bishop e3, or maybe if c4 happens, he doesn't want to dissolve black's pawns. He just plays d4 now, actually, because his knight's supporting e4. h6 is played. Now we see a4, a bit of restriction of black's counterplay on the queen side. That b5 discouraged now. Now black does do something with his c5 pawn. He plays c4. Okay. Now our understanding of the bishop pair and double pawns is, obviously it's much more dynamic nowadays. I mean, a lot of players might consider this as a kind of reverse Maroczy bind and leave the pawn on c5 to bind d4. After all, if white's not playing d4, then black centre is more stable, and can this bishop just be left seemingly a bit behind the pawns for the moment? But with c4, okay, we get d4, and we've still got double pawns for black. So what was black's idea here? After ed, bishop takes d4, black now plays the sharp looking move bishop b4, so immediately threatening, well, knight takes e4 maybe, but white castles. Now c6 is played, so black is not castling routinely. He plays c6, and he's getting in a little bit of trouble now, because after e5 this pawn is supporting d6 and f6 potentially, and in fact knight e4 it's immediately supporting more evidently d6. If this bishop wasn't covering d6, that would be quite nasty. And now moving a piece again, knight f4 is played. If this knight wasn't here, there'd be a bit of a cheapo, by the way. Takes, there'll be knight e2 check, but the knight's there at the moment. And white can also now just immediately get into the d6 square, bishop c5, which looks a little bit embarrassing. It's just easily weakening black's dark square complex. Would this occur in a modern, world championship match, that black has played, c4, he's weakened his dark squares a bit more, and he's allowing a very simple basic dark square exchange. Well, actually, we sometimes get to see this sort of thing with there was a decisive game which was similar, seemingly basic dark square bishop exchange and exploitation on dark squares. Nothing changes in chess. It's a basic key thing about chess, dark square strategy. It seems white has an advantage here. After the queen's come off, this knight on c5 is looking painful. b7 an immediate target, it moves, and the knight now hops into the d6 square potentially. Knight b7 hitting the rook, goes into d6, and it looks pretty nasty. And even more so after knight d4, threatening the poor c6 pawn. So black, had this kind of reverse Maroczy bind, and now is just under fire. And after bishop d5, okay, he's protecting c6, but this knight is now evicted, sacking a pawn with g3, a nice pawn sack. After knight takes h3, what is the point of this? It drives the knight back to g5, where another tempo gain is made, f4. Okay, but the knight has either got e6 or e4. It goes to e4, and now this other knight comes in. This first knight comes into f5, check. Picks up a pawn, so restores material balance. The knights prepared to protect each other, and structural damage has emerged from that. There isn't a major counter-attack on g3 here if the knight can be easily protected. For f6, hitting the knight like this is played. Okay. But now, a nice tactical move, rook ad1, indirectly defending the knight, because it looks as though rook takes g7 can be answered here with knight e6 check. Using that pin. Okay, the king is in the centre after all, so it's not that incredible to have this resource. It moves now. Now the other knight does protect the distant knight on g7, so it looks a bit odd, this game, with a knight on g7 and behind that the g3 pawn. If only black can generate counterplay here. But can black directly go for the knight now? He actually plays f takes e5. Let's actually get an engine check on this position, if black has any counterplay chances here. It seems rook g8, technically black does have a good position. Rook g8, yes. So if the knight's forced back, f takes. Has this been played rather casually by Alexander then? Yeah, it looks as though engines like black's position here. Did he actually go wrong earlier? This g3, let's just check this g3 out. Was it actually needed? It's not really mentioned as a move. Okay, let's get back into the game. So it seems from an engine point of view, actually black was doing fine. f6, rook ad1, king c8, knight d5. Now f takes e5 instead of rook g8. Does it matter? It's interchangeable, isn't it? Rook g8 here. And we saw in that other variation knight h5 being played. So why are we seeing something else now? Maybe this is Alekhine magic at work, and actually this game in 1934, I don't know, I think Houdini was confused earlier in the other variation. Unless there's a subtle difference between Rook G8 and F takes E5. Let's have a look at this. What is going on? Rook G8 first makes maybe all the difference. If the knight is forced back, then F takes E. That's the key difference. E6 here, you just play Rook D takes G7. So a bit of an inaccuracy from poor Bogoljubov, as he made a mess out of this. Then he had Rook G8. That seems to be the case here. Force the knight back to H5, then undermine the centre, and have good prospects attacking the E pawn. So the way he's played it looks the same by transposition, but it's not. White gets to have another option, which is a very, very important option, which unfortunately didn't exist before. You know, E6. And this is the brilliance of Alexander. You might wonder, what on earth is E6 about? Are you not going to lose 2 pieces for the rook? Where's the compensation? Why would you want to allow black to get both knights just for a rook? There's a really nifty move coming up. Rook D takes G7, knight takes, rook takes G7. And it's been mentioned to me about endgames recently. I think that there is a greater magnetism effect of passed pawns to become queens in endgames. That's my clue to you. So, all endgame gurus here, with the passed pawn's lust to expand, that's another clue. What fantastic combinatory move would you play here if I give you 10 seconds starting from now? Or you might want to pause the video. So 10 seconds starting from now. Okay. Endgame. Passed pawn. Try and queen it. Rook takes D5. What does this do? Very forcing move. Not many options for black. Takes. Now what? 10 seconds starting from now. Do you see it? Amazing stuff. Check. King can't go to D7 now. Check. Forcing a pawn on F7 if he takes. And the knight wouldn't be able to stop the queen here. If takes, how do you stop the queen? You can't with the knight. It's not possible. So black is just going the exchange down. What a total disaster. From a good position. He had a good position. He's blown it. He's just the exchange down. The rest, as they say, is technique. And fine technique. You know, Rook E6 just getting a very simply winning king and pawn ending with the outside passed pawn. Resigns. Black resigns. What a disaster for black. There's some interesting ideas though about well, the first thing we can observe is that the champions are aware of the relationship between how they feel, how tired they are, and the opening choices. So they're minimizing risks. If they're not in a great mood for mental work, then it seems implied by Alexander Alekhine to us here from his notes that the exchange variation of royal pairs is something to go for. So that's something for us to learn from. And you might wonder, well, how does that impact chess style? Well, the fact that these games are so heavily publicised, it would have influenced the style of other people to maybe use this variation of the royal pairs at that time, maybe, to show it's quite dangerous. So knight c3, the e pawn is defended, d3, c5. So after h3, bishop e6, no effort is made to put the brakes on black playing c4. c4 does actually activate the d6 bishop. Actually, from an engine point of view, is it worth playing b3? b3 is actually implied here to try and restrict these double pawns. So, you know, maybe Bogo does have a keen sense of dynamism, and you know, he's playing to liberate his bishops, and it's an invitation which is accepted here. After first playing h6 though, first playing h6, not playing c4 here immediately. Now, is that actually, you know, another major subtlety here? h6 would seem to be avoiding the bishop g5 or knight g5. If he plays c4 immediately, let's just technically work out the ramification of this. If c4 was immediately played, then d4, ed, bishop d4 seems an advantage for white. Why does h6 make all the difference first? I'm not entirely sure. He waited for a4 basically. Maybe that's the significance, because a4 kind of weakens b3, and if you're going to do this, or this pawn's going to move, maybe it's something to do with being further encouraged by the fact a4's been played, that c4's a viable move. Okay, c4 was tempting, whatever. It was tempting here. Took, and he played bishop b4. So that's another point. By waiting for a4, that bishop can go here without being kicked. So there's more tactical justification. The bishop was a prisoner on d6 before, behind these two pawns, which provided that Moxie bind on d4, but he's making use of it. So, and basically that e pawn could have been a losing liability pretty soon. And he doesn't want horrendous double pawns by moving this bishop and allowing bishop takes c3. So this looks like, actually, it seems as though black, trying to be objective, was playing a provocative game and was hoping for some weaknesses to exploit. And he did liberate his bishops. And this bishop might even in the future go back if this d6 issue was resolved. But this forceful exchange does actually weaken white also, as well as black, on the dark squares. It's a two-sided picture we want, really. It's not just weakening black on the dark squares. This pawn is potentially a vulnerability. And you know, you've got the undermining move f6 at any point, so this knight on d6 maybe isn't such a huge deal if the tactical threats white's generating can be parried. Bishop d5 was not only defending, it was also attacking white's king. And with g2 under fire, actually this pawn sack, what else is there? Is white really going to play a move like f3 to defend here? G2. He played g3. Let's see. Is black already better here? Apparently there's a nifty move here. King h2. f3 is f6. He doesn't want to do a passive move like that. f6, and it's undermining the d6 knight. But there's other moves more dynamic. King h2, just let the pawn go and use the g file maybe. Here rook takes g7, bit of dynamic play for white. Okay, so he played in a dynamic kind of fashion anyway, but it seems, you know, this is almost a reckless thing. I think maybe Alexander really, he was taking risks with this stuff. After f6, you know, he plays the tactical move to defend the knight for the knight e6. Now the knight's attacked again, he defends it, and he relies on this inaccuracy. If the inaccuracy wasn't played, we'd really have a weak pawn on e5. I'm just trying to be objective about this. So he's played this game with slight incaution. Unfortunately, you know, this shows Alexander's brilliance, though, this continuation. There's a subtle difference here, where the knight doesn't have to go back here, because this fantastic resources available for e6. The pawn from e5 is now an absolute menace for queening, it seems, it transpires. After this check, after this rook takes d5, this check and rook f7, the pawn has become a menace, picking up the exchange. And after that, he's got past a pawn, he gives up the rook to get the knight. That's the end of game. Okay, a very interesting game. From a few angles, for how that would maybe instruct or educate, you know, enthusiasts worldwide, you know, especially the decisive World Championship games, I think will be given even greater influence and impact on the style of play of of people worldwide. Comments or questions on YouTube?